Alright everyone, this is a video that I'm shooting. I don't know if it will be the last video on this topic or possibly the first, but I'm leaning towards the last because it's not a topic that you can actually get a real good faith conversation with people on, because the truth is that opinions have already been formed. So in November, I decided I'd start researching and reading as much as I could from authoritative sources on the USS Liberty incident of 1967. It was June 8th, 1967, which was I think it was the third day of the Six-Day War between Israel, Egypt, and Syria and Jordan were also in it. So I was going to produce something much longer on this, and then I decided it's not worth the effort because people are really looking to validate their preconceived notions of it. So here's what is known about it. The USS Liberty was assigned to do surveillance along the coast of Egypt, more specifically the Sinai Peninsula, a few weeks prior to the outbreak of the actual war. So they didn't know when they were on their way whether a war would break out or not, such that by the time they arrived on June 8th, the war in that area was largely over. The Israelis had already overwhelmed Egyptian forces, and the Sinai Peninsula had been taken by the Israeli forces. And then apparently the ship was actually surveilled several times by Israeli planes and other aircraft. Mainly planes, I would say. Only planes. Okay, I don't think that there was any surveillance helicopters in any of the accounts that I read. So we'll go through the three books that I read about it. But yes, the synopsis is basically that there was surveillance throughout the day of June 8th, and the ship was eventually assaulted by several flights of Israeli planes, Mirage and Mistar planes, which were the French aircraft that the Israeli government or the Israeli Air Force was using up until probably the mid 1970s. So those planes first assaulted the Liberty. There's disputed claims over how many flights went over. Some of the people who survived the attack claim it was many more than I think the three that Captain McGonigal or Commander McGonigal, William McGonigal, the skipper of the Liberty, claimed. So there is a dispute over how many actual passes were given over the Liberty, but to date there's been no evidence that it was more than the amount that McGonigal said during the court hearing by the U.S. Navy after the war, or after the incident. So after the aerial assault, there was also a naval assault by three Israeli motor torpedo boats, one of which launched a torpedo that did hit the Liberty and actually punched a hole that was, I believe, 40 feet in width within the ship, and it caused a 9-degree list in its bearing. So it'd be 9 degrees tilted to starboard. So all of those are indisputed facts. Now, what are the disputed facts? Disputed facts, for example, are whether the U.S. Navy had mustered a group of bombers to react to the incident, and those would have been coming from one of the other fleets in the U.S. Sixth Fleet that was in the Mediterranean. I'm not going to go through all the details. I don't remember which ship it was, but there was an aircraft carrier that did launch eventually a flight that was recalled. But there was allegations that there were two flights that were recalled, and one of them had been recalled simply because it had been equipped with nuclear weapons. So a lot of that stuff is a little bit more about whether, like, what did the United States know and when? What did the Israeli government know and when? How much of this is really, I guess, willful, malicious intent on the part of the Israelis in killing U.S. sailors? I think it was 34 U.S. sailors were killed in this attack. And there are people who nowadays they try to paper it over and say, look, it's I mean, I've seen people try to say, oh, it didn't really happen. No, it did happen. And the Israeli government admitted the same day their culpability for the incident. And within a year, they did pay restitution to the families of the sailors and the sailors who were injured and did not die. I guess the contention could be that, I mean, I don't understand sometimes what the contention is. This is what I have a problem with. The Israeli government did admit that it was to blame. They tried to shift some of the blame to the U.S. because A, they didn't notify the Israeli government that the ship was there, and B, they were apparently, they were, I guess, sailing too close to the coast, and it was a war zone and whatever. I don't think you can excuse any of it. And a lot of people, when I debated Israel in 9/11 with a person who's a believer that Israel is to blame. I think in this case there is no debate to be had. Okay, unlike in that case. In that case, I don't believe that there is any evidence supporting the claims against Israel, specifically related to the 5 Israeli movers that were arrested on 9/11, known popularly as the Dancing Israelis. But in this case, what do you want? The Israeli government admitted that it happened. They admitted that there was, they paid restitution. Unfortunately, a lot of what happened in the incident was covered up for over 10 years, and then some other stuff remains under wraps up until today. And why does it remain under wraps? It's not only possibly because it was damaging to the Israeli government. There was a lot of incompetence on the part of the Navy that was covered up. John McCain Jr., the father of the senator, so it's not John McCain who was senator from Arizona, it was his dad. He was a rear admiral who presided over many of the proceedings. He was the commander of the U.S. Navy in Europe, so he dispatched Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd to hold the naval court at sea. I don't think it's called a court martial. It was called a court at sea. Court of inquiry. That's what it was. And he apparently hid a lot of the details. Now, some of the details show that the Israelis may have caused more damage to the ship and done more passes over it, aerial assaults, than was previously thought. Now, and including the use of napalm. So this is something that I agree that the use of napalm is something that was a bit understated. Let's just put it out there. The use of napalm is something that is considered basically a more cruel way of assaulting someone. Now, it was used on the ship. However, in the event more people died, this is something that's important. Yes, people died from the air assault. I don't think people died from the napalm as so much as from direct fire by the Israeli aircraft guns that were mounted on the aircraft, or by the rockets that were launched at the ship. However, the majority of the people that died from the torpedo that was launched by the ships. So I'm not trying to look at this as some way of absolving anyone of guilt, because the guilt was admitted. So I can't just go and say, oh, it really wasn't their blame. They admitted that they were to blame. There are other ideas that have been used by people who look at this as some sort of grand conspiracy, including the idea that Moshe Dayan, who was the defense minister, ordered the bombing of the Liberty. There's actually no evidence of that. Dayan's been dead, I think, since the 70s or 80s anyway, so it doesn't really matter at this point. He his career ended a few years later during the Yom Kippur War, because I think he was still the defense minister at that point. And after that, the reputation of a lot of members of the Israeli senior establishment was ruined. Now, those are things that are basically, they're the topics of discussion. Why would the assault have happened? It's not a matter of who's to blame, because almost anyone who's really honest does admit that the Israeli government is to blame, because they admitted that they're to blame. Some people are saying that it was done in order to cover up Israel's imminent invasion of Syria during the war, which doesn't make any sense. First of all, because there was communication by the Israeli government to the U.S. government that they were going to do it. So why would they have to cover it up by bombing a U.S. ship in order to do it? There was this information was transmitted to the Johnson administration the day before it happened. So, and some of it was actually published in the press, that there were forces that were being transferred from the southern theater to the northern theater. So you're going to tell me that by bombing a U.S. ship, you would actually negate the coverage of the international press? It doesn't make any sense. Think about things logically, okay? If you have a government that is in the midst of a war and they're trying to, I guess, prosecute that war as well as possible, why would you try to cover up your actions by attacking a ship of a country more powerful than any of the ones that you're currently at war with, and which is the top adversary of their main ally? You have to remember, both Egypt and Syria in 1967 were allies of the Soviet Union. Egypt later broke off a lot of that alliance in 1972 with the Soviet Union. But in 1967, they were huge allies of the Soviet Union. So look, I'm not going to get any deeper into it right now. I know a lot of people are going to be butthurt anyway, even though I've never denied any issues with it. I think it's obviously a disgrace what happened. I think the Israeli government should have been more forthcoming, and some of the things that they did try to, I guess, do a lot of PR razzle dazzle after the incident. But people's lives were lost. I understand totally the sentiment of people who were on the ship, the families of the people that were on the ship, who lost their loved ones, or whose their sons were incapacitated by it. I don't think that you can honestly look at this as something that was some sort of minor incident. But in the grand scheme of things, it's been 53 years almost. It's going to be 53 years in June. The liberty is not a reason to deny foreign aid to Israel. And this is coming from someone. You have to realize, I'm someone who's opposed foreign aid to Israel for the past, I don't know, a long time, 5, 6, longer than that. I've been a deep opponent of it. The USS Liberty is not a reason for it, because when it happened, the U.S. wasn't really supplying military aid to Israel. It was France that was I think France was even just selling it to the Israelis. So this was something that preceded that relationship. The relationship itself has caused Israel to make a lot of concessions. That's why there was the 1978 Camp David Accords. It was 78 or 79, it doesn't matter. It's because of that relationship that Israel conceded a lot of stuff in the Oslo Accords, basically allowed for the creation of an enemy country in its own borders. So all of that was done in the name of preserving this U.S.-Israel foreign aid relationship. And it's something that I think when people, they bring up the USS Liberty incident. The USS Liberty incident is a completely separate problem that preceded what we're talking about today. And if you think that this is something that is a good line of attack towards ending this relationship, or ending literally any other foreign aid relationship, you don't know what the hell you're talking about. something that happened 53 years ago is not the basis for changing policy today. The leadership of the Israeli government at the time is mostly dead. So you can go through the list. Levi Eshkol, who was the prime minister of Israel, Levi Eshkol, died only a couple years later, died in 1969. The defense minister, Moshe Dayan, I think he died, I can even check. So we'll look at one by one. Moshe Dayan died in it says here, 1981. Yitzhak Rabin died in 1996. Was murdered, in fact, assassinated. Or no, he was murdered in 1995. So yeah, he's been dead for 25 years almost. So he was the chief of staff. The most of the government at the time is dead by now because this was 53 years ago. And I know some people will try to say, well, so what? People want to bring up things that came from before that, like World War II and you know, things that happened in Germany and stuff like that. Those things, this is something I want people to understand. American foreign policy should not be made based on things that happened years and years and years ago, 2 to 3 generations ago, by governments that are long out of power. When President Clinton reopened relations with Vietnam in the 90s, it was a good idea because the world had to move on from the Vietnam War. I don't remember there was a single person who protested in the streets against the U.S. reopening relations with Vietnam because people had decided to move on from the Vietnam War. Somehow, when you look at incidents involving Israel, a lot of people can't let go of things and they want to regurgitate it and they don't want to look at it honestly. But if you're one of these people who's still interested in the incident, which is fine, and I think that people have the right to read about it, I'll tell you the sequence I worked through. There were 3 books that I read, and all 3 of them are worth at least looking into. The first book that I read is a great book. If you're going to read anything, it's this one. It's by the son of one of the Liberty's officers. His name is James Scott. It's called Attack on the Liberty. And it does look very, very soberly at the circumstances. It does look at the Israeli influence on American foreign policy during the war, including the Johnson administration's goal, in part, of, I guess, getting more support for the war in Vietnam by looking out for the interests of Israel, which it was a bad strategy. This is why. So the book is good, and I think he lays out a clear case of why the Johnson administration was misguided, because President Johnson knew that a lot of the opposition to the war was from among Jewish Americans. There was, for example, Daniel Ellsberg. I think Daniel Ellsberg came a little later, but Ellsberg was a Rand Corporation contractor who leaked the Pentagon Papers. And Daniel Ellsberg could be seen as like the typical person who would be, as you know, the liberal Jewish mindset. And he was against the war because he felt that it was basically killing a lot of people, innocent people, and wasting the lives of both civilians and U.S. soldiers. And Daniel Ellsberg has been looked at as a hero ever since then by the anti-war community of all over the spectrum, I think. I bet there's some people who would say something negative about him. But in any case, so Johnson was looking at using his support for Israel in order to gain more support among influential Jewish Americans who were normally against the war. It didn't really work. So this is a great account. You can find it on any book sales website on the internet. Not going to mention any names because whatever, I don't get any revenue from it. But it goes through it all. It's one of the more recent books, so it compiles actually a lot of the facts from the 2 other books I'm going to present to you, and it does give a fair assessment. It doesn't overly try to attack the Israeli side, but it doesn't let them get away with some of the dissembling and It actually goes into how the Israelis were trying to haggle over the restitution. It tries to get into how they were trying to, I guess, what's the word? They were playing a PR battle after the incident, trying to make it look like it was entirely the fault of the U.S. Navy and the U.S. government, even though they did admit that it was their fault. They were trying to show that it was their fault, but it was America's blame because they put the ship there. And there's a little bit of a truth to that, because the USS Liberty was virtually defenseless. All it had was two 50 caliber guns, and other than that, if it had been attacked by any country in the spot that it was a sitting duck. And it's actually it would have been very easy for the Israelis to have completely sunk the Liberty, because they had, they could have just ordered more air assaults. They could have, sent another group of torpedo boats to attack it, because I think they ran out of torpedoes because the torpedoes were inaccurate. But ultimately, this book is the best one you can read about the incident, and then it gives you some more insights about where else to go for it. The second book I read is a little bit more biased against Israel, because it is written by Jim Ennis, who is a former serviceman on the Liberty. He was, I think, the second mate on the Liberty. This book is pretty good. There are some alleged inaccuracies on the part of Ennis, and let's be clear here. This was a first-hand account by him, as well as a compilation of accounts of other servicemen. So it's a valuable record of the way that many of the servicemen recalled the incident. But James Ennis, there's a little problem with his first-hand account, which is that he was injured early in the aerial attack, and then he was put below decks, and he was pretty much being, he was being attended to medically during most of the attack, including the torpedo attack. So while it is valuable to hear from people who were on the ship during the time of the attack, if you're below decks, so you can't really observe what's going on outside. I mean, there's no portholes in the medical bay, or I think they were using the ship's mess hall in order to treat the wounded. No, you can't see what's going on. So what he is compiling is basically his rendition of what was told to him by other crew members. So yes, it's a valuable book. It's not necessarily a book that carries the authority of someone who can, I guess, refute the account of William McGonigal, who was the skipper of the ship, who was on the bridge of the Liberty for the vast majority of the incident. And this is what's really important, that McGonigal's account is disputed by a lot of his crew members. Also, James Scott, he does talk a little bit about how McGonigal's account isn't really supported by other members of the crew. But that's the real problem, that you have a dispute. This is what's so ridiculous, okay? People want to say that there's a big conspiracy about the USS Liberty. So the actual skipper of the ship, who had, he gave his testimony. His testimony was much different than that of some of the crew members, including Jim Ennis. But the McGonigal was in the bridge and they weren't. So think about that. He was in the bridge, they weren't. He was witnessing most of what was going on, they weren't. Obviously, you're going to have differences of opinion of what happened, but that is a real problem when you're trying to make this leap of faith and claim that someone who was wounded during the incident couldn't be on the bridge, that he's going to be the authority. But yeah, it's a good work. However, there are cases, including a conversation he had with Maurice Bennett, who was another officer on the Liberty, that some people allege that he actually lied about Jim Ennis. So Maurice Bennett claims that he went to a meeting with Senator Fulbright, the senator from Arkansas, and Fulbright actually told him that Johnson had told him that they were going to cover up the incident and basically, you know, scotch it all. But Maurice Bennett, according to the next book that I read, which is by A.J. Cristall, who's dead now, but this book I think is a little bit too charitable towards the Israeli point of view, but not entirely. And it's called a whitewash by members of the Liberty Veterans Association. But the truth is that a lot of what Jim Ennis brings forward is basically hearsay. In fact, in one case, he literally said that he was reporting hearsay. He reported that a certain naval serviceman went up to him and said that the CIA that he'd had a conversation with someone from the CIA about Moshe Dayan ordering the attack and whatever. I think it was at some sort of cafeteria in the Pentagon or something, and people and Ennis actually said that what I'm writing here is hearsay, right? Which he was honest enough in that case. But the fact is that the incident that he's talking about with Maurice Bennett and Senator Fulbright is not documented. It's apparently unlikely that Fulbright would have had the conversation with Bennett that he had. In fact, there are witnesses, according to Crystal, that claim that this never happened and that people were saying that the conversation went a different direction entirely. But again, those are the 3 books I read. There are other books out there. I'm not going to give an opinion on books I didn't read. My conclusion is this. Israel was to blame for it. There's no way to look away from it. They claim, the Israelis, that it was a little difficult to identify the ship because the flag wasn't flying at full mast. I think that that's a little bit difficult to believe. Yes, they could have mistaken the ship for maybe a large container ship, I guess, but they actually used a ship called the El Qusair, which was an Egyptian troop transport vessel. They said, oh, that's what it looked like. I'm not convinced at all. In fact, the A.J. Crystal's book, I think, kind of, shits the bed on that. It's really hard. They screwed the pooch entirely. You can't just claim, oh, it's that easy to mistake ships on the high seas for other ships. Therefore, a ship that's a quarter of the size of another one, yeah, you can conclusively say that people can make that mistake. No, it's things that, yes, people make mistakes, and then people should be accountable for their mistakes. And what happened was that the Israeli government conducted its own court of inquiry. To my knowledge, no one was ever criminally held accountable for it, which I think might have been appropriate. Apparently, the head of the Navy, or the deputy head of the Navy, had to resign. His career was over. So yes, people lost their careers over this, but it wasn't really dealt with appropriately by the Israeli government back in 1967. But guess what? We're not living in 1967 anymore. It's 2020. And we have to focus on why the current relationship is not exactly working the way it should be, according to some people. And the reason is that both countries are a little bit too involved in each other's internal affairs. By the way, the Trump administration, I think, did a better job of disinvolving itself in what's been happening in Israel. But the Israeli government, they have people who are lobbying over here. And it's just not something that American voters look on with approval anymore. They look very much askance at it, if not more. People hate it. People don't want foreign lobbyists in the country advocating on behalf of the foreign policy of another country. That's why you have ambassadors. That's why you have consuls. That's why you might have, things like that. Is it something that you can end within a day? Absolutely not. But that's about it. I think that you should try to read at least 2 of those books. If I was going to make a recommendation, the James Scott book. You know, this gives you a lot of what you need to know. And then if you're more curious, you can move on to the other two books or any other ones that are on there. So, some of the ones on the internet, they look to be full of shit, but, you know, I didn't buy them, so you can make your own conclusion. So have a great night. Please like, share, and subscribe. Also subscribe to me on BitChute and Subscribestar as well as Minds.com. All of those are under the tag Chef Leopard, at Chef Leopard, and on Gab at Starscream85.